So the video detailing the install of the 3-point Z-axis upgrade kit. Mine's gonna be just a bit different because I'm going through prototyping phases, but I'll explain it to you what's different for the current kit. First thing you want to do is remove your stock bed. It's easy enough. Just unplug it from the back. Take off all your leveling screws. Just pull the bed up and out. Second thing you want to do is remove the stock bed. On your carriage assembly here, you just want to loosen your front screws. After you take your 4 screws out for the stock backer plate, take those screws out, take these screws out, loosen the front ones, and these will, you can push this back, slide it like that, and come out on both sides. Or take off this plastic piece on the bed. Then you want to take out all your screws that hold the stock backer, which is these 8 up here, then the 4 on back. Take your bed out. Then what'll be left is this bracket with the anti-backlash nut here. It'll still be hanging on there. Then from there, you want to loosen your coupling here, both sides. This coupling will slide all the way down. You'll be able to pick up on the lead screw and tilt it out and pull it out. So after you've dropped your coupling, you can pick up your lead screw, and there's just enough room to pull the whole lead screw out. Again, you'll still have your backlash nut, and this bracket will be on. Go ahead and remove your backlash nut, your anti-backlash nut from this bracket, and take this bracket off. So you want to take a 10mm drill bit and clean up this bore on all 7 pieces, your 4 bearing blocks and your 3 brackets. Then you want to take a 2.5mm drill bit and chase these small holes here where your bearings go. So you can see the difference. The top one, the hole's been chased. The bottom one is a printed one. Don't mind the bottom of the bearing seat. That's where the supports are. It's gonna look like that. It is what it is. It does not affect the part. So once you have your printer with everything stock removed, it's time to install the linear rails. These are 330mm long linear rails. It'll work, this kit will work anywhere from 330 up to 400. 400s are kind of a common size. 330s is what I got when I developed the version 1. So the version 2, you can use 330 up to 400mm long linear rails. These are MGN 12 rails. The mounting locations, this is all 20 by 20. Make sure these are the H bearing blocks. The C's, which stands for compact, are 20 by 15. So they will not work with this kit. You need the H designation bearing blocks. So with the 330mm long linear rails, you got spacer number 3. That's going to go here. This sets your height. The 3, if you use 350mm long linear rails, you just make sure your extra height goes up here to the top. 400s essentially go from the bottom of this plate here to the top of this plate. These extrusions are like 401mm long, but if I recommend anything, it'd be the 400s because they just fit in there. You don't need spacers. Then you use this is the 4080 locating clip for the linear rails. These snap around and they locate the linear rails center on the extrusions. Same thing for your side blocks here, or your side linear rails. You also have a 4040 extrusion clip that goes on and locates your linear rail center of the slot. There are 2. Just make sure you put one down at the bottom, put one up at the top. Then when you go through and tighten these, when you tighten your M3 socket head cap screws, just snug them up as you go down, all the way down to the bottom. Start back up at the top, then tighten them down. It is recommended to use a magnet to keep your blocks from moving. You can see I got a magnet on all of these. Next thing you want to do is install your bearings into your bearing blocks. These are a press fit. They are kind of tight. So what you do is you just put them in here, then flip this upside down on your desk or the floor and push down to seat them all the way. It may help if you take a razor blade and chamfer this edge. Version 3, I'm going to have a radius in here, or a fillet, to help with installation. So once you have your bearing all the way seated, you'll take your little button head cap screws and you'll put them on here and just snug them up against the flange. Once you have your button head screws in, this is what it looks like. All this does is retain the bearing. You do this on all 4 of your bearing blocks. And on your bearing blocks, they're caddy corner, so this bearing block, this bearing block here also fits this one here. And on your tops, it doesn't matter if your bearing blocks are like this or if they're like this. You have enough room for everything. And you can see we have all 4 flanged bearings and the button head cap screws installed. After you get your flange bearings installed, take your M5 by 16s and your T-nuts and install 4 of them per each block. When these blocks go in your linear rail, they do have a locating edge right here, and you'll need to use spacer number 1. Take your spacer number 1 and set it on top of your extrusion flange here. Then you can slide your bearing block bracket in. So on the bottom, you want to put your spacer number 1 down here. Take your bearing block, make sure the flange bearing's facing up, and slide it into your extrusion and tighten it down. So after your 2 bearing blocks are installed, you want to take your brackets. On the top of all your brackets, these big holes here are for your M5 heat nut inserts. This one here on your rear bracket is for your M4 for your Z offset if you're still using it and not using a BL Touch. On all your brackets where the lead screw goes in, again, you want to clean up the big hole with an M10. These small ones you want to clean up with a 3.5mm drill bit. Alright, so I just cleaned up the holes with a 3.5mm drill bit and a 10mm drill bit. This just allows the screws to pass through freely. Then you want to also install on all your brackets your M5 heat nut inserts. There's 3 on the left and right bracket and 4 on the rear bracket. You want to install them to where they're just below flush. So after you get these are M5 by 8 by 7 heat nut inserts, you may be left with some plastic that's a little proud. Take a file, clean those up. As you can see, I just knocked the ridges down, and that would be good enough. So now that you got all your heat set inserts installed, we can continue to the installation process. You want to install your anti-backlash nut on your lead screws. These are 400mm long. So once you have your backlash nut on, you can go ahead and install the backlash nut and lead screw into your bracket with your M3 by 30 socketed cap screws. I'm using M3 by 35s because I previously drilled these out on a different version of the kit. You don't need to tighten the screws down real tight, just snug them up. After you get your backlash nut on, you want to go ahead and install your timing sprocket. You want to make sure the small flange is down and your locking set screws are towards the top. You also want to install your top bearing block on your lead screw, then this will slide in. You also want to make sure you loop your belt around here first, then slide it in from the top. So make sure your belt's on, slide it in from the top. Your top bearing block will be loose. You want to slide this up and use the spacer from before. Use your number 1 spacer that was down here. You want to bring it up here and set it up there, and that's how you slide up your bearing block here. So you get your bearing block up top, pull your spacer out. You just need to tighten these up. Not super tight, but tight. And again, your bearing blocks have a locating nub on them to set against the extrusion here. And they go on like this. Next, you want to set your bracket. Use your M3 screws and tighten your bracket to your bearing block. I have my bracket tight to my linear rail guide block. So now when I turn my lead screw, I have movement. Next, you want to put on your thrust bearing. Once you get your thrust bearing installed on the bottom of your lead screw, you'll take a locking collar and put it on here. Easiest thing to do is just to raise this up, raise up the lead screw, and slide your Allen wrench for your M3 screws underneath of it, and that'll give you enough of a clearance where your gap, it'll set your gap there. Then you want to go ahead and tighten up your lock collar and make sure your set screw falls in one of the grooves on the lead screw. So after you tighten up your lock collar, you can pull your hex wrench out. Then you want to go ahead and tighten your set screws on your timing gear. Now you will feel these lock into the grooves on your lead screw, and when that happens, you want to rotate this until it tensions up your thrust bearing on the bottom. So I've got this set screw loose. This one's somewhat tight, snug, and you can see as I rotate this, it travels up the lead screw. That's what you want. Then you want to hold the lead screw tight and tension this. You want to tension this against the bearing, and this will suck up the thrust bearing and the lock collar, and it'll sandwich all this together to make it solid. So now you got your timing gears tensioned up here. There should be no play. If you lift the lead screw up and down, there shouldn't be any play. If there is, you just need to tighten it a little bit more. So now you got this whole assembly here moves, and we're going to move on to the back one. Same thing. You get your backlash nut installed on your lead screw, slide your lead screw up into the hole, send down your M3x30s into your any backlash nut and snug them up. Then we'll install that as one unit. Once you get your rear bracket and your backlash nut installed onto your lead screw, set your timing gear on here, and you want to just snug up one of these lead screws so it doesn't, or the set screws, so it doesn't fall down when you're installing this. So now that the set screws just a little snug on the lead screw, we're going to want to slide this up into the hole. There's a hole up here behind the limit switch that your lead screw goes into. There's a hole up here where the lead screw goes into. Then you want to slide this in and drop it down into the shaft collar, and make sure you got your belt on before you do that. Then take spacer number 2. It's going to be the one with the slot in it. This spacer is going to go between the bottom of your shaft collar and the plate, and this sets the height for your timing gear. You have your spacer number 2 slid under the shaft collar. Make sure that the collar's touching your spacer here. Then you want to tighten the bottom screw first. Then when that one's tight, you want to lift up your lead screw about 1 millimeter, just to where the 2 shafts aren't rubbing. So you lift up your lead screw about 1 millimeter, then you want to tighten the top screw. And you got the bottom screw out. You just want to lift up your lead screw about 1 millimeter. It ain't much. If you lift it up too much, it will hit up at the top. You just want to find the happy medium there, and then tighten your top screw there. So after you get your set screw tightened, you can loosen the set screw you snugged up on your timing gear to drop this down. So as you install the screws, my suggestion is start with one and just get it started, then switch to the other side, get one started, then just go back and forth until you get them all started. Then after you get them started, you can go back and kind of tighten them down in a progressive manner. Just snug them all up one by one. If you tighten one block down all the way, you have a risk of binding it to where the blocks will be, they'll try to be riding the rail sideways. So just progressively go back and forth and snug them down. So they're all snugged up. Take all my magnets off that were holding the guide blocks. Then next is to level these brackets. Just measure down from the top of the bracket to your base. Then set these all the same height. And then we'll put the rear timing pulley on and tighten that up with the belt. So I got them all leveled. Easiest way to do this is I just take one of my spacer blocks and put it on there and just measure. For instance here, I just used 250 millimeters to the bottom of the spacer that's laying on top of the bracket. I did that on all 3 corners. Then once they're there, and now we can put the timing gear on the rear lead screw down and tighten everything up. And when you do, make sure you don't let anything move here. If you have a hard time getting your belt on the back, you can take your belt and raise it up over these hubs here, then put the back on, then drop the belt back down. And now if anything has moved, you can still adjust it. There's enough slack to where when you rotate your lead screw, the belt will skip. So everything should be pretty close. Just go back and make sure they all measure the same. So I've all got mine all set at 250 millimeters. Don't worry about these layer lines. This thing was printed at 300 millimeters a second for a prototype. So these are all set at 250 millimeters above the plate here. So next is to go ahead and snug up your rear idler pulley. Alright, so after you snug up your rear pulley, go back and make sure you're still level at all 3 points, at the same height above the base plate. Next is we're going to assemble the tensioner and install it. Your M5 by 30 will go here. Your M4 by 60 will go through your mounts, go through the center of your tension arm, then through your bottom mount. Then your M4 by 35 will go through the end of your tension arm here through your bearings. So you have your bearing spacers. These go into the top of your bearings. Flange part on your spacer, the top flange, also goes to the top of your bearings on your bearing flanges. So they sit flush. Do the same thing with the other one. Just pushing here. Now you can stack your bearings. Then put your bearings in the end of your tensioner arm. Use your M4 by 35 to go in from the top. there is a 1 M4 lock nut you put on the bottom of this here, on the bottom of your tension arm, just to keep it from the screw from backing out. So once you get your bearings in here, your bearings and your spacers, you feed your M4 by 35 through, then you're going to put your lock nut on the bottom. Again, you have your M5 nut insert here. Feed your M5 by 30 through the back of your tensioner. This is going to provide tension on the belt. Take your M5 by 16s and put them through your brackets. Then we'll take spacer number 4 and we'll set the height of the tensioner. And take spacer number 4. It does have up and number 4 embossed on the spacer. Set that between the screws and your extrusion on the rear. Take your bottom half of your mount and put it in extrusion. The mounts do have a locating lip that sits on the back of the extrusion. You put that on there and tighten up your 2 M5 by 16s. You can take your spacer out. Then take your top half of your bracket with your 2 M5 by 16s and install that on top of the lower half. Again, the locating tab on the end sits on the rear extrusion. Now that you got your top half and bottom half brackets installed, you're going to take your tensioner assembly, your arm, and slide it in here. This will rest on the belt. Then take your M4 by 60 socket cap screw and go all the way through the top, your tension arm, and through the bottom. Then you can use a nylon nut to lock everything in place. You have your M4 by 60 screw installed all the way through, your nut on the bottom. You can set the tension. It doesn't need much. You can just rotate it a little bit, then adjust this. It all depends on how much run out is in your timing gears. Some gears are better than the other. You'll find that if you buy a cheap set of timing gears, that the center hole is off center to the teeth, and it'll rotate, it'll oscillate back and forth. You don't need much tension on this belt. I mean, there's not much tension on here. And once you get your tensioner set, you can grab this belt and feel if there's any high or low spots on your timing gear. And if it feels tight, just loosen your tension a little bit, then it'll get better. For the people who bought the stock backer plate, use M4 by 20 in these holes fed in through the back to mount to the angled support pieces for the stock backer plate. For those who have the stock backer plate, there's clamps that go here that nest into the cutouts. You want to take your M5 screws, go through your clamps and into your brackets here and just snug them up. Then your 4 M5 screws will go through the 4 holes here in the back, and then your 4 M4s will go through the back of your bracket. The back of your bracket here, your M4s will go through here and tighten to the back of the bracket. Now that your backer plate's installed and you have all your bolts tightened up, your bed installed again, fire up the printer and do your bed leveling, set your screw if you're using it, use your BL Touch, whatever you need to do, then set your bed level with your 4 screws and do a test print. Other than that, you don't need to do anything.